Welcome to another episode of Your Business Unleashed podcast. Today we are talking about everybody's favorite topic, which is provincial sales tax, right? It's everybody's favorite topic. BC just announced some big changes this year that professional services businesses need to be aware of. This is a major change. Honestly, if you're like me, you're going, oh, PST, I'm an Alberta CPA firm. Why do yeah, okay, we got a few clients in BC. Why do I have to deal with this crap? Like I just, come on, it's BC hasn't charged, we don't have to charge PST. We're professional services. We do a bit of business out of Alberta into BC with BC clients. And all of a sudden my world and my billing system and everything's about to be flipped upside down. And I don't even want to deal with this stuff, but we have to. So with me to explain the changes to you is David Crawford, our residential indirect tax leader. Thank you for being here, David.
Thank you. Yeah, this is probably one of the biggest expansions in BC's sales tax base in a long time, and forever until, since they introduced PST on legal services, a very long time ago, they stayed away from taxing professional services. But in the interim, both Manitoba and Saskatchewan both have PST regimes, and they started taxing professional services, not just accounting and tax, bookkeeping, all that stuff that we do. But they, architects, engineering, geoscience, a whole host of other professional services. They started taxing them, and now BC's kind of playing catch up, to be honest.
Okay.
They're using that as the backstory, but we all know BC's in financial trouble, so this is, extra tax.
Right. So why am I listening to you on this stuff? Why don't you give us a bit of a background about how you know about this stuff and sort of what's making you worried about the practical applications of this, and then we'll get into the details.
Yeah, I've done a few articles on it. I've spoken to, pretty large groups of CPA firm partners across Western Canada recently about it, and looking and talking to actually people in the legal services business that had to deal with the implementation of BC PST on legal service many, many, many years ago,
Yeah.
and the problems that they ran into. And I think that not just CPA firms in or outside BC, but all these other professional services such as, engineers, architects, geoscience, a whole list of other, property management services are going to be taxable. I mean, that's very specific to BC's, but and that firms outside of those provinces, like you said, well, why do I have to deal with this? It's like, well, actually, when they brought in the rules for legal services, they were designed to capture legal services firms all across Canada. And these rules are no different, whether it's, taxable accounting services or engineering, et cetera. It's good. Arguably it affects even US firms, to be honest. But Canadian firms are easy to get hold of, right? And so
Yeah.
they can be assessed PST for failure to collect and, register for and collect and report and remit that tax. And unlike GST system or HST system, BC PST is a cost to your business. You can't get it back, so it's not
There's no
refundable.
ITC. Yeah.
No input tax credit, so you get an input tax credit on the 5% GST you pay, right? But the PST is a fixed cost, so it's adding cost to, individuals who acquire it, or a business that acquires, services from us or a BC firm, if it relates to their BC operations or their BC personal taxes or whatever.
Okay.
We have to charge the tax too, right? Just like a
Yeah.
BC firm.
So just to back up a bit here. So at Aitken Henderson, I'd say the lion's share of what you do here isn't actually for Aitken Henderson. You've actually set up a business at our business where you support other professional services firms who deal in or need help with sales tax, indirect VAT tax, whatever you want to call it, indirect tax. This is like it's a niche area of tax law. And, I hate to say it, but most entrepreneurs, not most, but a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of people sort of stick their head in the sand about this stuff and just kind of want it to go away and they treat it as very simple. Like we get that broadly in the industry where we go, yeah, it's 5%. It's fine. It's not. It's so complicated. There's a whole other set of legislation around it. The applications and the treatments do not mirror income tax. They do in some. They overlap in some respects, but they don't in a lot of respects. And I just find it incredibly confusing. And having you as a resource since we started Aitken Henderson 13 years ago has been super valuable in helping us navigate audits, or even what, even just planning for our clients on, hey, we're looking to expand into BC or whatever. What does this mean? I'm not going to answer those questions as a generalist. So if you're an accounting firm and you wish you had a GST secret weapon, you've got one on the call here with us. And so let's get into this PST treatment. All you have to do, by the way, is reach out, and David's, happy to work with your firm on setting this stuff up. So, okay, let's start at the beginning. So lawyers used to have to charge PST. Well, they still do, but they were the only ones that had to charge PST in British Columbia. And PST, as you say, is on professional services. It's a one-way tax, okay? And so that means you charge it and you can't claim it back, and that's it. It just dies at the invoice level in terms of, it's unlike GST in that way. And so the big changes are coming in when? The big changes, October 1. So they've given us plenty of runway to deal with this. I admittedly have spent the last 4 months since you've been screaming about it. When was the budget?
Middle
February?
towards the end of February, usually February 18th or something like that.
Yeah, so I've spent a few months just kicking this down the road going, man, I don't want to deal with this, but it's coming. I'm going to have to adjust. We're going to have to adjust our billing system now and register for PST, where we didn't previously
you can
have
register
to have
now,
that.
Technically, if you
register. Yeah. As soon as you register, you have to start collecting, though.
Nope. There's a whole set of transitional rules that came out. Sorry, they're not out in law. It's out on BC's website. They have a bunch of different examples about, how services that straddle and payments that straddle the implementation date of October 1, when we are required to charge our BC clients or even Alberta clients with BC operations, when we have to charge them PST on those taxable accounting services, which is pretty broad.
Hold on.
I
just want to park you there for a sec. Hold on. We are doing work for an Alberta client who provides BC services, or what? How did you phrase that?
And so if they have a branch office in BC is a great example. And I have a client that's in a BC PST audit right now, and they have, the Canadian head office headquarters is in Edmonton, but they have a branch office in BC. Well, they actually used to have two. So if I'm dealing with a BC PST audit and I'm doing a bunch of taxable things,
you as in David,
October 1, and I'm dealing with the BC location, in theory, that's subject to PST after October 1.
So you have to split your fees up according to the location of what you're doing. Wow, that's a huge mental lift in terms of, did I spend that 15 minutes on the BC branch or was it on the Alberta branch?
50-50.
Right, or both, or is it? Yeah, and what's my methodology, and will that methodology be accepted by the CR or by the BC government under audit? Wow, what a nightmare. Okay, so we've established that October 1st we have to be registered. We can register before that. We have to charge 7% on supplies. What's the deal on supplies? So is anybody operating in BC?
You're talking about a firm?
Yeah, like when we charge on our supply to them, what's the criteria for us having to charge PST? That they're operating in BC?
So there's a couple different definitions in the legislation, and I call it considered a BC matter, right? Does it pertain or relate to BC, right?
Okay.
And so it could be, an example in an audit, right?
The easiest one is my clients in Vancouver. Boom, PST. But there's going to be way more complicated ones than that, which you were about to just tell us on one of them.
Yeah. So example, let's say it's an Alberta company, but they got this BC branch, and say it's part of an audit, you got to go out there and do an inventory count, or you got to establish that they have certain fixed assets in BC. That part of the audit, in theory, is subject to BC PST, right?
Oof.
But the rest of it might be just GST for the Alberta main operation, right?
Sure.
And so there's going to be thousands of possible permutations to this, right?
Right.
Just based on the type of business. So we haven't imagined what they could be, but in the legal services world, they've dealt with this. They've figured it out. So we're going to work with some retired lawyers and retired CPAs that worked at legal services firms in Alberta and across Canada that cut their teeth on this, and we're going to get it figured out, not just for CPA firms, but for CPA firms clients like the engineers, the architects, and all the other newly taxable professional services, and how we're going to implement this. And so I've sit on a working group with BC Finance on in terms of how we're going to manage, deal with these audits and interpretive issues and so forth. So it's going to be kind of a fun few months leading up to that, but then it'll be post implementation, probably audit controversy of, catching people who didn't register, or they did, but they didn't do the tax correctly in the first, say, 3-4 years. So it's going to be a big deal. And I think most CPAs that I work with in the sales tax world do see how convoluted this will become.
Okay, so what if I'm a CPA, a US CPA firm? I got my firm set up in Seattle, for example,
Yeah.
and I'm selling accounting services in for BC clients. Do I have to register
That's
for
quite
PST?
common actually for US CPA firms in Washington State to do personal taxes for people that work in or live in
On both
Washington
sides?
and take the train or bus or drive over to Vancouver. That's not uncommon, and vice versa, right? And so in theory, the way the wording of the legislation is, it's broad enough to capture that Seattle CPA firm or bookkeeper or whatever.
Oh boy. Oh boy. Okay, another interesting one that I think is super relevant now is we've talked about, I think the thrust of the conversation so far has been focused around professional services companies who are not operating out of British Columbia. They're just providing services into British Columbia. And we've established that that is now a PST thing. So now Aiken Henderson has to go register for PST. Yuck. Aiken Henderson has to change our billing systems now and set up some internal control systems to go, is a little bit of what you did. How do we catch that? Right. And
Yeah.
how do we adjust our bills? And by the way, we're mostly on an automated billing system. So we need to set all that up at the front end at the proposal part so that we catch it on the billing part, because our bills are
Communicating with clients, right?
communicating.
It's
Yeah.
just the heads up that this is coming and
Your
some
bill's
part
going
of
up
your
by
bill,
7%.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And documenting on the bill, breaking it out as a separate tax,
Yeah.
and telling them it's coming. So the proposal or the engagement letter is going to have to specify, and maybe you have to agree and say, well, maybe 50-50 part of your bill, because half your operations are in Alberta, but the other half's in BC, is okay, maybe half your bill's subject to PST. And
Wow. You're
BC, yeah,
negotiating with your client about
that's
what
kind
they,
of
and
where
it,
BC's left it with. That's right in their latest guidance is you guys figure it out. I don't think that's the final answer, but that's what we've got to go on right
really,
now.
really. So there's
Well, it
no,
should arguably come from us, the CPA firm, for example. And it's like, well, we know from history, from dealing with you business for the last 3 or 4 years, that we know it always takes way more time to deal with your BC operation or vice versa, not picking on BC, to do all your work because, I don't know, let's just say you got a bad bookkeeper, whatever, in BC. And it's always way more to clean up your mess. So maybe it's 3/4 of your bill pertains to BC, even though only half your revenue comes from there. So that's BC hasn't really given us a lot to go on in that regard. I
oh
think that'll come
man,
out with more guidance later in
I
the
sure
year.
hope so, because absent that, we end up in a situation like 7% is a big delta on a bill.
Yep.
If I were to just carte blanche raise our fees by 7%, some people would scream for sure, right? Some people, what was 7%? Whoa. And now you're probably without legislative guidance, or at least some guidance by the BC government on this, you potentially end up in a situation where a company who's, let's just say, all of their operations is in BC, and they want to hire a firm that they were previously hiring a firm out of BC in order to not, well, I mean, even in BC, now they can shop around a bit, or, well, I guess, no, sorry, they've got a toe on both sides of the border, Alberta and BC. They could potentially shop around a bit and say, hey, that firm's going to do me a little bit less of a BC PST allocation, and that's going to save me. The dollars could get substantial here. So we need some legislative guidance on this.
Yeah, so the way it reads right now is a BC firm that deals with a BC company doesn't really have that flexibility. Is it looks like the way this is going to be interpreted is that if you're a BC firm providing those otherwise taxable accounting services to a person or company that resides or ordinarily resides in or carries on business in BC, you got to charge tax on the whole thing, plus disbursements. So disbursements are generally all going to be taxable as well. So
Even if
when
there
we
was
worked at the
no
big firms,
PST on
they
that
would,
disbursement in the first place.
right, you know, the big
Wow.
firms, how they work, right? They just have a big percentage at the bottom of the bill that says admin fee, 10%.
Got it.
That's going to be
Now
taxed at
it's
7% as well as the professional fee as well.
oh,
And then 5% GST. And of course, that's refundable. But so yeah, it's going to be I don't think this is going to be a fun year for anybody who's got to implement this or for me for that matter that's got to help people figure it out because
yeah.
the guidance right now is fairly minimal for all of these services, not just taxable accounting services and CPA firms. Over the summer, BC has promised that they will produce the final regulations, update the bulletins, create more, frequently asked questions, and give more guidance. But there'll always be a situation nobody thought about before, right? And there'll be these, disputes with clients like, well, I want to, I think half of your bill should be subject to PST. Well, what if only a third of it? You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah. It's
who's going
messy.
to come back after the fact and say, well, a PST auditor is going to say, well, you ended up doing 80% of your work for the BC branch because of whatever reason. Well, it shouldn't have been 50-50 split, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about professional services firms that are not in BC. What about professional services firms that are in BC? Obviously, this applies to them as well.
100%. Like I said, they're the ones that, if you have a BC firm, and this happens from time to time, is let's say they have a personal tax client for years and years, and let's say they move to Ontario or they move to Costa Rica or whatever. Well, that can get carved out because it's clear that that person, the customer or the client, does not reside or ordinarily reside in BC. So in that example, let's say they're doing Costa Rica and they still got to do a Canadian tax return. That shouldn't be subject to PST, which makes sense, right? So, and there's 3 sets of rules, and it's reflected in legislation on their website that they just updated back May 5th, I think it was, on scenarios where, services provided in BC, presumably by BC professional services firms, those provided outside BC, and those scenarios where you're providing services in respect of BC and another jurisdiction in or outside Canada, right? And so there's kind of those 3 scenarios to work with. So it's a bit of a decision tree to get to the answer. So it's not easy, but.
So that's been updated then, because I think I could be remembering this wrong because it was the middle of tax season or something, but I think I remember you saying something like the way it's currently worded or the way it's in the budget proposed is that these firms that are headquartered in BC are going to have to charge PST to everybody.
Yep.
Carte blanche. And it sounds like that's moved. The needle on that's moved now. So was there a change in there?
Yeah. So I think they've probably realized that error. I don't know.
Because that creates a competitiveness problem now, right?
It does. Yeah. They don't like that. So over the summer, these regulations will probably fine tune a bunch of that stuff.
Yeah.
And then presumably by end of August, early September, which only gives people kind of basically a 1 month head start or, before the deadline to sort of really go, oh, here's the final rules. Now I got a month to implement it. So, but they've done as much as they can to provide us decent amount of information and obviously, mostly draft and sometimes pass legislation from the budget to go on, right? Which is effectively a copy paste of how they did the legal services many years ago.
Right. Okay. So these changes in where you didn't previously have to charge PST and now you do, this isn't just professional services. There's a few other things that are getting hit by this, right?
Non-residential real estate commissions will be caught in there. Obviously, that's pretty much a BC real estate, issue. But BC property management, I think it's commercial or residential services are going to get caught in there. So, the big one I think is engineering, because a lot of that in the natural resources industries and firms not just in Alberta, but all across Canada, maybe even the US that are working on, engineering and architectural type work for major infrastructure projects in BC, whether it's for the government or otherwise, particularly the natural resources industry, from oil and gas, timber, lumber, uh, you know, oceans and fisheries and so forth, right?
I'm looking at cable, landlines, and toll-free telephone services. We've
Oh,
got in
that's
your
from the
blog here.
budget. Yeah, those are just other miscellaneous PST budget changes. So that's kind
It's-
of,
Everybody's cable bill's about to go up by 7%. Oh boy. Okay. So for everybody who's listening to this and not watching it, David just nodded uncomfortably yes. And so yeah, if you've got a residential landline, maybe it's time to cancel that.
I call them
Uh,
other little minor tax grabs in the BC budget of 2026. But
well, I guess that's what happens when you're set to run a $14 billion deficit next year at a provincial level. Yeah, we gotta start generating revenue somehow, because Lord knows we can't cut expenses. Uh, that would be the wrong thing to do. What else do we need to know here? What do we need to do to prepare?
start turning your attention to this. Doesn't matter which, professional service you're in, is start getting your customers and clients educated a little bit about what's about to happen. Like you said, turn your attention inward about educating staff and talking about, how we're going to have to address this, and then coming up with a plan for all the way from, engagement letters and pricing work all the way to billing it, right? Keeping track of time, right? If you're a time-based business, keeping track of time of stuff that relates to BC versus what doesn't. Perhaps setting up separate billing codes with separate tax codes, depending on what type of accounting system and billing system that you use, or time tracking system, to be able to do that. So I think anybody who's doing their first bill in say October or November, I guess November, December, is going to have to deal with that and the transitional rules. So those transitional rules may not, that first bill or two may not actually have tax on it if it falls into the transitional rules, which we don't have time for. It's laid out really well, on BC's website, and to a lesser extent in our recent blog article.
Yeah, one of the things that is in that blog article that I think really hits home for me in terms of preparing for this is, yeah, we got to start. I've got a list on my whiteboard here of the 8 clients or whatever that do work in BC, and one that's considering moving to BC. And it's like I'm going to need to start talking to them about that, and I should probably do that before October 1st. So because yeah, 7% increase on a in one case I can see up there $120,000 a year bill, that's meaningful, right? So they need to understand that, hey, like, don't shoot the messenger here. This is your government is raising funds here to fund their $14 billion deficit. So sorry, but
Right.
that's
And
what I have to do.
if we can realistically and reasonably bifurcate that work between their BC versus non-BC operations, if that exists,
Yeah.
then great.
Yeah.
Let's start talking about it, because we
you-
can't leave that till the first bill. Right?
And
We
you are
need
the
to talk about
perfect
it.
guy, I might add. You're the perfect resource for professional services firms who are dealing with this. If anybody wants to get in touch with David to talk about this with respect to their professional services firm, whether or not you're in BC, but if you have clients who are, it's time for a call with David. You can get a hold of David at www.aikenhenderson.ca. His contact information is on there. Just fill out the form and he'd be happy to help you. And then, I hate to tout you as the secret weapon, but you are the secret weapon when it comes to indirect tax. And he doesn't just work here. He works for a number of professional services firms across Canada and in the United States, helping people with inbound investments. So thanks so much for your time, David. I really appreciate this.
Thanks for having me. It's going to be a fun summer.